Our next panel examines the role of water systems and infrastructure in wildfire response and resilience. This conversation highlights how universities and initiatives like the Sustainable LA Grand Challenge can serve as conveners across sectors, helping connect infrastructure planning, policy, science, and public understanding around shared resilience challenges. Moderating this conversation is Noah Haggerty of LA Times. He is joined by Greg Pierce, our Senior Director of UCLA's Luskin Center for Innovation and the Chair of Sustainable LA Grand Challenge's Wildfire Working Group, Faith Kearns, who's Director of Research Communications at Arizona State University for their Arizona Water Innovation Initiative, Edith Guzman, who is a Water Equity and Adaptation Policy Cooperative Extension Specialist for UCANR, and she is also housed out of the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation. She's also a tree canopy expert, if you get a chance to bend her ear. And Mike Antos, Principal Integrated Water Management Specialist for Stantec Consulting. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Well, good morning. Lunch is on the horizon. But first, why can't we stop fires once they start? It's a bit of a provocative question, but there's a nugget of truth in there. We experience wildfires all the time. Many of them stay in the wildlands. They'll maybe threaten a bit of the WUI areas. But generally, our systems and firefighters are very good at responding to these types of blazes. But once fires transition into urban conflagrations where the primary fuel is people's homes, we get into a whole different ballgame that is much more complex and much harder for us to answer. And our goal here is ultimately not to get rid of wildfires. They have the ecological benefit, and I don't think we could stop them if we tried. But we're trying to reduce the amount of destruction that they cause and prevent lives lost from them. We've heard a lot from our past panel about the solution space that we're talking in to deal with this challenge, and water systems and infrastructure fits into that. We've heard about what we can do in the wildland landscapes through fuel management that might look like reducing the density of trees and forests or getting rid of flammable invasive species down here in Southern California. We've talked about the urban landscape, things like home hardening and defensible space. There's also what humans can do in real time before fires through ignition reduction programs, and then how we respond to fires once they start through our fire service. And our water systems and infrastructures are one of the primary tools that firefighters have to respond to these blazes. And I see two sides to the challenges that we face in water infrastructure. One is a technical question: where is our water infrastructure currently, and where do we want it to be in the future? And the other is an expectations challenge. So what do stakeholders and what do residents expect from our water systems versus what is reasonable to expect from our water systems? On the technical side, I think of an analogy from the general manager of the Kinaloa Water District in the Eaton-Burn Scar. He gives this analogy of a coffee shop where every day they sell about 300 cups of coffee, but then once every maybe 10 or 20 years, they get asked to produce 40,000 cups of coffee in one day. They could meet that requirement by hiring a ton of people and buying a ton of coffee machines, but they would probably have to charge people about $100 per coffee. So the question is, what is reasonable to expect from our water infrastructure during these extraordinary circumstances, and how do we address those challenges in a cost-effective way? And then on the expectation side, we often people expect when they turn on their faucets to get water, and people expect when they call 911 for the fire department to show up. And in these extraordinary circumstances, that's not often the case. In the Palisades, for example, a lot of people are very frustrated in their government officials. They see government officials essentially, in their mind, abdicate responsibility, say that there was nothing we could do during extreme winds, and that our water systems weren't designed to handle these fires. And there's some truth in that. But for individuals who are being asked to take on their own requirements and responsibilities, it can be a hard thing to hear. And so this isn't only a question of how do we communicate these challenges in an accessible way, but how do we meet people emotionally where they're at. We won't try to come up with the answers to every single one of these questions today, although I'll award some bonus points to anyone that does, but instead focus on understanding, coming to a shared understanding of the questions and problems that we face and how we can collaborate between our public agencies, researchers, and stakeholders to address them. So I want to start with Greg Pierce, the Senior Director of the Luskin Center for Innovation. He's also the chair of the Urban Water Supply and Fire Working Group, which has been a collaborative effort to address some of these challenges. So maybe to start, what are some of the unique challenges that we've faced in Los Angeles and how the working group is aiming to address them?
Yeah, so thanks for setting up the conversation. I'd say I'm as surprised as anyone that we're here talking about water in a wildfire symposium. If you told me in December of 2024, we're going to have 2 major fires, some other fires in Los Angeles, we're going to have this meeting today, what would we be talking about? I wouldn't have expected water to be on the agenda, because the reality is, and really there is expert consensus, unlike some of the other topics we're discussing today and in the wildfire space, like you said, that no water system can stop wildfire, urban conflagration, whatever you want to call it. They haven't been designed as such. We can talk about, I'm sure we will talk about, what they can do differently, but there are hard limitations. Our research also showed that the water systems in LA, and there were about 11 in the wildfire areas, performed pretty similarly, if not nearly identically, to water systems in past major wildfires. Yet the narrative was completely different. The narrative at the outset was that water systems failed. The headline that ran in every publication from yours to the far reaches of social media was the hydrants ran dry. And that was sort of water systems' fault. And that was unique to these fires. Again, you can go back and look at water system performance in past fires, nearly identical, but the narrative was quite different, and water was singled out as one of the major, not the only, of course, sort of major water systems as one of the major places to point the finger in the LA fires, and that's persisted to a large degree. And that narrative, fueled in part by certainly politicization and our fractured media environment, but I also want to, give credence certainly to what that narrative kind of was fueled off of, also an intuition for everyone that water puts out fires, and also the fact that we do have these fire hydrants sitting everywhere that you can see, and the frustration that those fire hydrants can't put out the fires we experienced. And so that's, I think, really where the working group came in. We talk about design by collision. I think it was sort of an undesigned collaboration that came out of the early weeks of following January, where everyone on the stage was, well, you are a reporter, but we were talking to reporters trying to answer the same question over and over again. There was unprecedented attention on the issue, so we decided, with the support of Sustainable LA Grand Challenge, to form this working group focused on water supply and wildfire issues. And we've carried that work on, to the present day, produced a bunch of different types of publications and a lot of different engagement, from individual conversations with community members to, briefing of the state legislature, everything in between. And we see that, that work continuing really, in part because there's a huge research gap, because, again, people thought the answers to this issue were so obvious that actually not a lot had been written down, but more so as a really necessary long-term effort to inform public understanding and policy decisions in the space that can move us forward in a way that's reasonable, and so that we don't overinvest in the wrong thing. But yeah, that can really support the mitigation adaptation that we all want. So I think with that, I'll turn it back over to you, and happy to continue the conversation later.
I want to bring Faith Kearns into the discussion, the Director of Research Communications for the Arizona Water Innovations Initiative at Arizona State University, also a part of the working group. And before we lost her to Arizona, she spent over a decade at the California Institute for Water Resources. We've heard a little bit about the technical challenges we face and a lay of the land for this kind of expectation or communication challenges. So I'm wondering if you can kind of set the communication scene for us. Why can't we just simply rely on water systems in these extraordinary fires?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Greg sort of outlined it already, just in terms of, at a basic level, these community water systems were not designed to put out multi-block, multi-neighborhood fires, right? And so that is just the priority for these water systems is really providing drinking water, potable water to your home, and not necessarily fighting a very, very large conflagration, particularly in a highly urbanized area. So there's just that at a fundamental level. And I want to just put some of that a little bit into context. About 20 years ago, I was working for a fire center at UC Berkeley, it was faculty directed by Scott Stevens and Max Moritz, and I'm having a little bit of PTSD this morning because a lot of the issues that are coming up right now in terms of thinking about, zone zero, home hardening, all of that kind of stuff, we were dealing with 20 years ago. Our group was very involved in the initial development of the fire hazard severity zone maps that came out in 2007. Incredibly controversial at the time. Hard to believe, but a lot of the science that we were doing around home hardening was also very, very controversial, although it is interesting to see it come up as controversial again. And, I think it's sort of this interesting challenge that, now the water systems are sort of brought into this whole set of things. Like Greg, I don't think I necessarily would have thought we'd be sitting here having this conversation, although in 2017, I was in Santa Rosa. I had just done a workshop for a bunch of UC volunteers with the California Naturalist and Climate Stewards program. And it was one of those days that I know many Californians recognize. I was standing on a ridge at the Pepperwood Preserve. The wind was blowing just so. The temperature was just so. The dryness in the air, it just was like, something's going to catch on fire tonight. And that is actually indeed the night and the place where the Tubbs fire started. And that was, for me, as somebody who had been working on water and fire issues for most of my career, a really defining event. It took a few weeks to get to the fact that the actual water infrastructure in Santa Rosa had been damaged sort of beyond other records that fire set, like jumping the 101. And I just remember, for the first time really hearing that the fire had burned hot enough to actually burn underground water pipes. And that really was this sort of like galvanizing moment. And within a year or so, I had applied for funding to try to understand this issue a little bit better. Luckily, joined up with Greg, we wrote a report that after COVID and all sorts of delays came out in 2021 to very little fanfare. I remember sending it to a couple of reporters around the state. They were sort of like, interesting, but like didn't feel it was very urgent.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, you weren't one of them, Noah. But and then all of a sudden the LA fires hit, and it took about 24 hours to kind of go, oh, this is the issue we were writing about 5 years ago, and to see it really play out the way that it has in LA. And it's been fantastic to be a part of this working group at UCLA. I feel like we've made a lot of advancements, and I'd say the key one really is, I think, a pretty large consensus that we need to kind of right-size our expectations around what water systems can really do during a wildfire. California isn't the only place that this has happened. Just last summer, I wrote an article in High Country News about a wildfire at the Grand Canyon that involved some exploding chlorine gas tanks, and they had to, evacuate the Grand Canyon, evacuate all the hikers there. These are things that are happening in New Jersey, happening in Georgia. So this is really turning into a very sort of widespread problem, and I think we're getting toward some solutions. I feel like the working group has done some really great work, but there's more to do.
You asked this question, what can we expect water systems to do? So I want to bring in our third panelist, Edith Guzman, a water equity and adaptation specialist with the Luskin Center and the University of California Cooperative Extension. You spent a lot of time on the ground in the burn zones, thinking about these value trade-offs between what do we expect from these systems, during that extraordinary day versus the expectations and what we want to get from these systems every other day of the year and every other year. And so what can we expect our water system to do and handle?
Well, in coming back to that analogy that you brought of a coffee shop that's typically producing 300 cups per day, and then all of a sudden here we are trying to have them produce 40,000 or whatever the number was. There are a few things that we can consider on the menu of options. But again, you already brought up the fact that we're looking at trade-offs. So what we can feasibly expect, reasonably pay for, will differ, of course. That said, the working group has been spending the last, 14, 16 months now thinking about what that menu looks like so that water systems can consider what the future might look like. And I will preface all this by saying that virtually everyone that we've talked to in these systems is really trying to do the right thing. It's not that anybody's sitting on their hands. These are fundamentally difficult things to pay for. There are lots of reasons why it's a challenge. But let's go ahead and talk about what some of those menu items are. So the first and perhaps most obvious one is adding more water supply. So that can be done in any number of ways. Again, none is cheap nor free. But we can look at maximizing surface water supplies via things like adding tanks or reservoirs. We can look at things like having water hauling trucks ready to go in these types of events. If you're located in a coastal area, you could think all the way to pumping ocean water as a potential. You can also think about things you can do for your system to maximize how it presently works and optimize it for these types of events. So that could be things like updating or upgrading or upsizing your pipes. You could look at things like automating pumps and upgrading those. You can also, of course, fire hydrants are part of the mix, and not all fire hydrants are created equal, so you can certainly look at that as well. Power is a big part of it too. Water is very stubborn. It doesn't really like to move uphill. It doesn't really like to move quickly. So thinking about strengthening working relationships with power, the power side of things is one way to go. Retaining things like generators and backup power supplies, and even battery storage. Those are things that systems could consider doing. Private property also has a role in this, so you can consider what are the opportunities for augmenting some level of supply on private property. Of course, again, it's all about trade-offs. I'm talking to you mostly about kind of physical things that we can do, but collaboration, that's a theme that's already come up today. Coordination with others, that's a key ingredient here as well. So as one example that kind of bridges both the physical and the kind of collaborative spaces for systems to create interties in between them. So that's literally connecting physically one system to another in the event that a system is hit on the west side, but just to the east of it hasn't been hit, or an adjacent system hasn't been hit, and can provide some kind of assistance during that time. So, we're certainly not the first instance of these types of catastrophic fires. Yes, they are becoming more frequent and certainly more catastrophic, but there's a history of this, and we looked and continue to look at examples from around the world. So in the wake of the 2009 Black Saturday fires in the state of Victoria in Australia, now new developments in particularly high hazard areas actually have to have a on-site water supply. This is private property with a minimum volume in certain areas of 10,000 liters in a tank that cannot burn. So that means something that's concrete or metal. In 2007, after the Angora fire, This was in the Tahoe area, their Tahoe Water Fire Suppression Partnership came to be. This is a bi-state collaboration with Nevada and multiple entities, and they did things like system improvement projects, upsizing water lines, installing new fire hydrants, increasing water storage capacity. So some of the things on this menu that I was walking you through. And perhaps the most extensive and perhaps probably expensive option is what San Francisco did. So they have an emergency firefighting water system that was stood up in the wake of the 1906 earthquake. That earthquake is particularly known for the fact that there were ensuing fires that devastated about 80% of the city, and that is still something that 120 years later is seared into the imagination of people who live up there. And so they have a high-pressure system that delivers water from a reservoir and a couple of large tanks, high-elevation tanks. That water goes down to almost 2,000 fire hydrants via 135 miles of pipe. That is not a cheap proposition, and in fact, every few years, people who live in San Francisco can expect to see a bond measure go on the ballot, and they typically do get funding for that. It is primarily run on fresh water via gravity-fed components so that you don't have the issue of what if the power goes out, and they can pump salt water in the event of every other type of backup sort of plan failing, but that's really an option of last resort due to corrosion damage for salt water. So again, these are all various options from the modest to like sort of the no holds barred, but they present trade-offs, none is cheap, and engaging with the community to think about what should our future systems look and function as is key to whether or not a system will take on any of them.
The hope is to translate some of these ideas into reality, and you gave some good examples of that. So I want to bring in Mike Antos, the principal integrated water management specialist at Stantec Consulting. As a social scientist and facilitator, he really thinks about how we work with stakeholders and public agencies and researchers to help the folks on the ground actually make this reality. And so I'm going to ask for a little bit of a reality check. What are some of the barriers to implementing some of these ideas? And as we know, public agencies have a lot of different priorities that they're managing at the same time.
Yeah, happy to join in the conversation. I sit in sort of a weird spot on the panel and in my career, and maybe even in this symposium. Does anybody else here have any experience firefighting? Just a couple. Okay, so I'm going to say a few things about firefighting from the stage here too, so hopefully I don't get I'm going to be very general about it. But in general, 30 years ago, I was a volunteer firefighter as I was working my way through my bachelor's program and then a little bit after that. And I've been thinking a lot about the memories of that time. A couple of things that I think are always worth putting into this conversation is that, the first folks that get sent to a fire at a house, their job is to make sure the people are out. The second people that come, their job is to make sure there's water on the fire. The third people that come are responsible for making sure that the exposures are protected. So that means the houses next door. And so that's the way firefighting shows up, is it shows up, protect the people, put out the fire, protect the exposures. And, the exposures to the houses next to a house that's on fire are in extraordinary danger from just radiant heat. It's not embers catching vegetation on fire. It's just radiant heat that's setting other houses on fire. Okay, so you're at a really big fire and you need more water than the hydrant there in front of the house is giving you. The engine you send to get more water hooks to a hydrant very far away, because if you just go to the next hydrant, you're going to be pulling the same water that you're already relying on from the hydrant you're already connected to. These hydrants are all mostly connected to one another. So if you open one and then you go to the next one in the line and you open it, you're stealing from yourself. And so these systems that we're tying into to help put out fires are designed for an emergency at a house or at a big business. They're usually sized to protect the infrastructure that's near them. So if a hydrant in a neighborhood of houses is sized to provide enough water to help fight a house fire. One that's in a commercial area is sized to help fight a fire at a big commercial property. And these standards are set by regulators. The water agencies are responsible for connecting the hydrants to their system and making sure that the pressure is there at the sort of duration it would be needed to fight a fire, so a couple of hours. So what you're then talking about is a system that is designed and priced to handle the emergencies that are expected. And now the priced part is key too, because it's the people who are getting their drinking water from the system that also happens to have hydrants attached to it that are paying for all of this to keep working. You know, when the crews go out to maintain the hydrants to make sure they're still functional, those people who are doing that job are getting paid for by your water rates. The people who are buying water to flush their toilets and take their showers and cook their food, those are the people who are up paying for those hydrants to be there. So whenever we're starting to talk about how do we take that system and make it bigger to handle a bigger challenge, we're immediately starting to talk about very complicated politics, economics, and then, of course, engineering. And so all of these things are really complex puzzles to solve in here. And the other thing I wanted to just kick into play for this dialogue, you know, our title is like, why can't we put them out once they start? I used to live, for many years, I rented in a portion of Pasadena that was right across the Eaton Wash from where the Eaton fire started. And the fire came into the neighborhood where I used to live. I don't live there anymore, but I still have friends that live in that neighborhood. And the house that I was in renting was untouched. My neighbor, who still lives there, his house caught fire 3 times during the Eaton fire and was extinguished 3 times by the fire service that arrived. And I don't know which city was there, but like they put it out, right? So we have thousands of stories of just agony for the people who lost their homes. But there are stories of places where these fires were put out by fire service connected to hydrants, right? That did work in some places, and we can't lose sight of that part of this. A fire truck comes with like 1,000 or 2,000 gallons in it. And it pulls up, it turns on its pump, and it starts spraying it out the big deck gun on the top, right? So it's putting lots of water on the fire. That 1,000 gallons or 2,000 gallons, that truck can empty its tank using that deck gun in 30 seconds or a minute. They are moving remarkable amounts of water when they are trying to fight a fire. It takes remarkable amounts of water to fight just a single house fire. So the puzzle we have here is that we have a system that's designed to solve a problem, and then we had a problem that we didn't design for. And this is really a conversation about what is the right design, which problem are we designing for, what should that design be, and are we all ready to do it? I think as Edith was going through the list of things that we could do, and I think you said it many times, all of them are expensive. And I think that's really the key that I'd love to finish my thoughts with for now.
So we heard that lengthy list of expensive options to varying degrees of expense, and I'm curious where, you know, in your work talking with community members, other experts looking at Los Angeles, where you think we might end up in 15 years. So what out of that list seems attainable to LA or viable options, and what are some of the trade-offs for Los Angeles specifically?
Is this for anyone?
I'll leave it open.
Okay. I'll start and say, to where Mike left off, I don't think the visible infrastructure, most of water infrastructure is invisible, by the way. It won't look radically different. Something we didn't talk about is a major, or the major reason that the distribution system and the network of pipes, valves, tanks, hydrants, etc., it gets water out to people after it's treated. It's all geared towards drinking water quality. And not only that, but there are severe trade-offs between keeping water drinkable and the things you would do if you're just rushing water through pipes to put out fires. So there's already trade-offs there, but if we mess with our core infrastructure, we introduce more trade-offs, and water systems get in trouble with the EPA. And people don't have drinkable water. So I think what we'll see, for the most part, in terms of changes to the infrastructure, is more, as Edith talked about, more open air reservoirs, more sort of mobile systems that connect into a source but don't actually, again, mess with the existing infrastructure. They kind of work around it. They're pretty limited, but there are solutions out there. I do think we'll see, certainly with the introduction of technology, things like on the water side, like we already have on the power side, automated metering infrastructure, but really that helps you shut off different parts of the system and reroute water. To some degree, that will be helpful, especially helping stop the bleeding out of the system on the private property side. But beyond that, I think, again, we've done a lot of work as a working group, and others come up with a menu that didn't exist, but we haven't had the chance to do a full sort of cost-benefit analysis of all these different types of interventions. That's going to take years to do to inform anything that we might do that's kind of bigger picture. And again, back to Mike's point, to Edith's point, the people who pay for it ultimately are us. The federal government hasn't given meaningful support to water system infrastructure in some time. It is unlikely to do so in the future. Existing state funds, firefighting capacity for water systems is not even eligible for basically any of those funds. So to do more radical things, we'd also need to rethink how we fund public infrastructure. And I'm all for it, but it's an uphill battle.
Yeah, I can add to this one too. So the LA County supervisors created an LA County water plan back in 2023. And among the 4 top priorities of that planning effort, one of them was developing a system for supporting small drinking water systems in the county. And we have some of the largest in the county. We have some of the largest in the country here in the county, but we also have many, almost 100 very small drinking water systems. And of course, the Eaton fire is characteristic of some of them, the ones that were impacted. That small water system effort created a task force their first meeting was scheduled for January 10th or 12th of 2025. And so, maybe slightly after that. And my team are facilitating that task force. And so we were getting ready to have the kickoff meeting, and then the fires happened. And we pivoted the entire agenda to just be talking about what happened to the fire and having the communities that were impacted and the water systems that were impacted having a chance to kind of like just vocalize where they were and how things were, and having everyone else on the call listening to this and thinking about themselves and thinking about how to support the mutual aid response. There was, as was heard in the earlier panel, just the fabulous mutual aid response occurred for the systems that were impacted. MWD, LADWP, private utilities, everybody flooded folks into the region to kind of help these systems get back on their feet. But this small system task force, because of the timing now, we're rolling up towards the end of the effort of developing a small drinking water system support program on behalf of LA County Public Works, and it will be moving its way up through approvals in the next series of months. But central to that system, that support program, is helping establish greater collaboration between systems. So back to the interties idea that Edith was talking about, but then also the relationships between the drinking water systems and emergency responders. And so the larger water systems and the larger fire departments who operate in the same space, they know each other. And so when the fire department opens up an emergency operations team, the big water systems send somebody because it's relevant for the two of them to be talking to each other. This isn't always the case with the smaller systems. So there is this effort in our region right now to create better collaborative work and networks of actors, both in water and in emergency response, to make sure that the systems are as well poised to support each other as they can be in the moment. The other thing I would add to the where are we in 5 or 7 years, there was already a mandate in California for backup power supply at drinking water systems. That was already a thing that the legislature had made a mandate for and made money available, not nearly enough, but they had done it. And I think that's one of the major things that we'll see true in 5 or 7 years is that, to Edith's point and earlier panel's point, I hadn't even thought of traffic lights. That's amazing. But the idea of having backup power so that when you either have an emergency shut off on purpose or the fire itself shuts off power, the pumps that are pushing the water around still can function.
I don't know if anyone in the room had the, I'll say, pleasure of watching the LA mayoral debate last night, but water infrastructure in the context of fire did come up, in particular the San Ynez Reservoir, and the conversation was one that honestly could have been lifted out of January 2025, in my opinion. And so I'm wondering how does public misinformation or misperception play into efforts to build a more resilient water system? And then how do we start getting folks on board and start building that trust and having those conversations? I might pull Faith into the mix first.
Oh boy. Yeah, we just had the third of our workshops focused on sort of the issue around communication, trust in public water systems and things like that. And part of what I was talking about during that workshop was just the extreme devolution of our sort of social media and general, communications landscape. And I like to show a chart that kind of just shows over the last, 20 years or so, where we went from sort of having a very few communications channels, social media sites, to what we have now, which is fragmented beyond. I'm a very online person, and I cannot anymore keep track of the Discord servers that people are on, and so we've gone from sort of the, a lot of people at the water cooler of Twitter to a space where people are having very private conversations in very different ways across all sorts of media that most of us don't even have access to, right? And this obviously isn't just a problem for water and fire. This is a huge problem just in general for where we are as a society right now. And so it's hard to kind of just delve into what that means on the fire and water side. But, Twitter itself at one point was an amazing sort of disaster communications tool, and there have been a couple of academic papers that have come out recently talking about how vital that was as a place where people could find out immediately what was going on. Often it would devolve, 10 or 12 hours into a fire or something, an earthquake, but you could at least go and find a bunch of information, and people were generally reading the same things. And we're just not sort of in that space anymore, and I think it is a huge challenge moving forward to try to figure out how to deal with it. That being said, I am a huge also advocate of the sort of just deeply community engaged relational model where we actually know and have people that we trust that we can start to talk to. And I think there's one of the things that came up in the workshop really was around the challenge of very formal disaster notices, say water boil notices and things like that. Agencies are required to put those things out, but most people don't hear about them from the agency. They hear it filtered through 10, 20, 50 other people, and who knows how old the thing is at a certain point and all of that kind of stuff. And so I honestly am not really sure where we are right now. The media landscape is, it's obviously not just our challenge. And so I think there's a lot of room to think about different models that may be more reliant on in-person, trusted messengers, and consistent communication. And I will give a shout out to the Cooperative Extension System in California, which I think, has a presence in every county in the state and some ability to do that kind of work where it funded to do that kind of work. I think that's about the most I can say on that right now, and others probably have other thoughts.
I just keep thinking about, we have tsunami evacuation signs all over the place, and I imagine those sirens still work. Right, like we've got that. Like, why can't we do that again? For a different reason in a different location.
Faith mentioned the Cooperative Extension Program. So part of your job, Edith, is to work with folks on the ground and help form that bridge between research and stakeholders. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on communicating this, or have anecdotes from your time in the burn zones talking with folks about what messages resonate with them and how we can connect with residents. Tall order.
What resonates with them, I think, is the idea that we can engineer our way out of a problem that has always existed, but is now larger. And I don't know how to kind of disabuse people of that notion that, I hate to use the word hubris because I acknowledge that there's tremendous pain in this. I live close to the Palisades. I was, mourning the loss of all my favorite hiking trails, and have friends who have lost their homes. I know many of you have much more personal experiences than that. But in the conversations that I've had anecdotally, I think it's human nature to believe that we can bounce back and we can control a thing that has hurt us. But in this case, what I'm seeing, and kind of coming back to a little bit of your last question, is that there's an attempt to it's what a friend of mine who lives in Altadena and is a builder there calls trauma-informed decision-making or trauma-informed rebuilding. We're trying to engineer our way out of this rather than perhaps understand that there are nuances that exist by virtue of us living in these beautiful places that are next to nature, that have drawn us for particular reasons, right? So I don't know. I mean, I think right now it's just still too raw for us to collectively sort of think through what a reasonable set of solutions looks like, what our ability to balance, sort of our urbanized sort of footprint over a space that not only bumps up against nature, but needs nature for all of the stressors that came up earlier today, fire being one, but not the only one. So I think we're going to be seeing that conversation evolve. Right now, I think and the reason why we're talking about water in the first place is because water systems became a very convenient punching bag because we need someone to blame. As our sort of maturity about this whole climate-induced series of catastrophic events grows, my hope is that we'll be able to have those more nuanced conversations to say how much risk are we willing to live with? We can't get it down to zero. I do think that the cooperative extension and other translating kind of, players do play a really important role in that. And it's both ways, I'll say. It's not just pushing out information from the university, but it's also feeding back to the university what is sort of ostensibly, possible for these people to take in, for communities to evolve into. So we're very much in it still, but I think there is a really important role for us to continue to keep our ear to the ground and also push out information as we learn it and as we collect it here.